It was a classic picture of Israel's view of the Middle East. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressing the parliament on the threats faced by the Jewish state. But many Israelis now believe that Netanyahu's domestic policies are a bigger problem, including President Reuvin Rivlin. He denounced the recent move to rein in the Supreme Court and muzzled the press. Rivlin said, "How can a threatened, conformist, toothless Supreme Court be in the interest of Israel, of Israeli democracy?" Critics agree. They say one reason the government's trying to control the courts is to prevent them from allowing human rights groups access to Palestinian areas.
Human Rights Watch, on my behalf, applied for a work permit so I could take up my post as Israel and Palestine Director on the ground in Jerusalem. We received a response on Monday informing us that our request had been denied on the basis that Human Rights Watch was not a real human rights organization, that instead we were engaging in propaganda and falsely raising the banner of human rights.
They also point to the ongoing investigation over abuse of power against Netanyahu. The charges include bribery and media intimidation and have been dismissed by the Prime Minister. Benjamin Netanyahu and his Likud party has spoken out against the media and the police investigators, accusing them of being behind a campaign to oust him by left-wing politicians. His Likud party has now introduced legislation in parliament to prevent investigations against a sitting prime minister, even if ordered by the Supreme Court. Even some of his strongest supporters say it weakens checks and balances inside Israeli democracy and creates an all-powerful executive. President Rivlin being the most recent and prominent critic from among his former supporters. But will the increasing criticism be enough to stop the growing power grab by Benjamin Netanyahu? Shoaib Hassan, the Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from West Jerusalem is Sharon Haskell. She's a member of the Knesset representing the Likud party. And from Tel Aviv is Neri Zilber. He's a journalist and Israel analyst. I thank you both for joining us. Sharon, are you unhappy with what President Rivlin has been saying about the ruling party and the direction in which the country is going?
Well, you know, what Rivlin is saying is a political thing as well. It's always a bit sad to see political dialogues between the governments and the President Institute. But, you know, this is a democracy, and sometimes we agree and sometimes we disagree.
But Sharon, I mean, he's from the ruling party. I doubt he has any designs on becoming prime minister. And from what he's been saying, that the coalition is endangering Israeli democracy and the checks and balances are going away, isn't this rather the warnings of a man who's feeling disappointed that things are slipping away rather than somebody trying to score political points? Shouldn't the government be listening to him?
Well, if you look on the presidency, once he becomes the president and he steps out of any kind of party frame lines, and so as a president, he's not connected not to the Likud and not to the Labour Party. He's meant to represent the entire people of Israel. And so even when he does say his political opinions, these are some of the things that we hear from the opposition, and this is what the opposition is trying to describe. But to be honest, if you look on Israel and its democratic institutes, you understand that Israel is the only true democracy in the Middle East. And so if you come and ask me whether Israel is going to look like one of our neighboring countries, my answer would be not a chance.
Okay, sure, but I'm not asking you whether Israel is better than Syria or any other country. I'm asking you very specifically about what the president's saying. So there's two issues here. One is freedom of the press, and the other one particularly is the Supreme Court, right? So he feels that the Supreme Court is losing its checks and balances on the government. You're saying he's sounding like the opposition. This is why you dismiss what he's saying. Just because this is something that the opposition says doesn't make it untrue, does it, Sharon?
Yeah, don't forget that in any kind of a healthy democratic system, there is always a dialogue and disagreements between governments, Knesset, the media and the High Supreme Court. It is okay to give your opinion about the Supreme Court. It is okay that the Supreme Court will criticize you as well. This is part of a healthy democracy where you have the checks and balances between those institutions. If you look on it, all of these institutes are strong institutes, and they will definitely continue to be like that.
Okay, so Neri, rather than the diminishing of the checks and balances, according to Sharon, this is a healthy example of the checks and balances at play, that the president can criticize the prime minister and the ruling coalition. What do you think, Neri?
No, I think your line of questioning was absolutely right. Ms. Heskel fails to mention that President Rivlin was sounding a warning, a clarion call for precisely that reason, that Israel's democratic checks and balances between the various institutions are being undermined systematically by this current government, and that's unfortunate, whether verbally or via legislation or proposed legislation, consistently, almost on a weekly basis. And that's what President Rivlin was warning about. And it wasn't a political message. You were absolutely right. He is a former senior Likud member. It was very much in the interest of the state, the primacy of the Israeli state and the vibrancy of the Israeli democracy. So Ms. Heskel likes to tar the president now as political, as sounding like a member of the opposition. They do this with the Attorney General. They do this with senior army officers. They do this with the Supreme Court. The media is left-wing, according to them, and on down the line. It's very dangerous, and I hope Ms. Heskel is right that Israel's institutions are strong enough to withstand it. We just don't know yet.
Sharon, are you doing this to the president and the Attorney General and the media and so on, tarring all criticism as, or rather just dismissing all criticism as not of value?
So Israel have a fully freedom of press. No one is trying to demolish that. And this is something that will still stay strong and maintain it. This is a similar thing with the High Supreme Court. We have a strong institutes of the High Supreme Court and the court system as well. What we as legislators are doing, we are bringing the will of the people in changes either to the legislations, current legislations, or bringing new legislations by the will of the people. And so when we are making changes to legislation, this has nothing to do with the High Supreme Court. This is bringing up the will of the people of how they want to view Israel in the future as well. And this is what we are changing. We are changing legislation. We are not demolishing the High Supreme Court. We make sure that it stays strong and we maintain it. Similar with the press.
Okay, and Sharon, let me read you a little bit of what Rivlin said. He said, how can a threatened, conformist and toothless court be in the interest of the state of Israel, of Israeli democracy? I can only describe what I see in what appears to be an ongoing attempt to weaken the gatekeepers of Israeli democracy. So, for example, we've seen in the past, lawmakers have done one thing, the Supreme Court has jumped in and said, actually, this is unconstitutional. Actually, we think you've made a mistake. That's what people refer to as the checks and balances of the Supreme Court. Doesn't Rivlin have a good point? He's saying if the courts are completely subservient to the lawmakers, what's the point of the democracy?
So this is a live debate that we have here in Israel. And the debate is when the High Supreme Court is actually changing legislation. It means that certain legislation that we are passing is actually being diminished by the High Supreme Court, sometimes unjustly. And so the question is whether the High Supreme Court is meant to maintain the legislation or to actually be the one who is writing or rewriting the legislations. And this is a live debate that we have. So this is, from our point of view, when we see that the High Supreme Court is rewriting legislation and inventing it, this is not his position. This is the Knesset, this is the legislator's position, and this is what we're actually doing. We are not limiting the Supreme Court power, but we are actually legislating in order to give the High Supreme Court tools to rule by it.
Right, okay, so Neri, is this merely a difference of opinion in a democracy, a healthy debate regarding the role of the Supreme Court?
No, I don't believe so. I think Ms. Heskell and her colleagues in the ruling party, in this current government,
go ahead, Neri.
In this current government are systematically going after the ability of the Supreme Court to rule, to fulfill its function in a democracy. So literally the Likud and its coalition partners are trying to pass legislation that would bypass the Supreme Court. By definition, that would undermine its role in the democracy. Ms. Heskell likes to talk about the will of the people. What President Rivlin and others would characterize it as is the tyranny of the majority. Majoritarian rule in a democracy, steamrolling any checks and balances, steamrolling the rights of certain minorities, steamrolling the role and the place and the ability of the media to function, and on down the line. It's not quite there yet, to Ms. Heskell's, I suppose, credit, but it's a very dangerous precedent, and that's what Rivlin was really warning about.
Neri, when you hear the Sport and Culture Minister Miri Regev say, and I quote, a president that belittles politicians, belittles the will of the people, and hurts the heart of democracy, when you hear that, what does that tell you?
Well, it tells me that it's a pattern, and today or yesterday it might be the president, and tomorrow it will be the Attorney General, like it has been, and the next day it'll be the police commissioner, and the next day it'll be the chief of staff of the army, and the next day it will be a certain journalist who writes something unflattering towards the prime minister or his family. It's quite dangerous, and I would say more than dangerous, it's unprecedented in Israeli democracy. And the Likud party, and Ms. Heskell knows this better than anybody, the Likud party was built as a liberal party in Israel. Its foundation, its building blocks were a liberal culture, both economically and also socially.
So Sharon, is Likud turning illiberal or less liberal as we go along?
Not at all. The Likud is the liberty party. We have always protected liberties, and this is the same here. If the president and if the Supreme Court have any kind of criticism about the government, about the Knesset, they are free to speak so and to say so. But it goes same way. If I disagree with the High Supreme Court, if I disagree with the president, and if I disagree with the media as well, I have the right of speech as well. I have the right to come and criticize them as well. And this is what needs to be maintained. Obviously, it needs to stay in a respectable frame. Not everything that was said, I completely agree with it, but I completely agree that every single either representatives or one of the democratic institutes or a citizen is absolutely free to criticize any kind of government institution. This is a healthy democracy.
Okay, and let me then add to what the president said, and my thanks to the New York Times for translating this. The former chief of Shin Bet, Yuval Diskin, wrote in Yediot Aharonot, he wrote in that column that if the ethical and moral rot that leads us continues, this incredible Zionist enterprise will expire. He was referring to Prime Minister Netanyahu and the ruling coalition. He also believes, like President Rivlin, that things are not going in the right direction. Don't you think that it's probably in the government's interest not to just dismiss all of this and maybe to take it seriously?
Well, we are taking everything seriously, but don't forget that every single person have political views. And with the political views, they bring out their agenda. And it's the same with Yuval Diskin. He comes with his own political view and with his own agenda, and he brings it out. He's free to do so. I actually would like to see more of that. This is freedom of speech. This is something that needs to be in a healthy democracy. I completely disagree with him. I can bring you other Shin Bet's former officials and leaders and things like that that will say the exact opposite. And this is what is healthy about a democracy. We disagree on certain things.
But Sharon, what they're saying is that the very foundations of the democracy are being eroded. They're not disagreeing about allocation of funds or the occupation or you know, the military and so on. They're disagreeing about the very fundamentals that you're championing right now. You're saying this is all a sign of a healthy democracy. They're saying the healthy democracy is dying on your watch.
So I would like to actually see an example for that. And any kind of example that you will bring, I will be able to debate that, because I believe that we're actually strengthened the democracy here in Israel. And by doing that, for example, we're legislating now new legislation about the character of Israel and how we would like to see it. We're also legislating about worker migrants that the High Supreme Court has rejected and tried to rewrite a legislation about it. And so for me, when I see that, I actually see the more we legislate, the more of a stronger political and democratic foundation we create. Don't forget, Israel is a young country. The foundation of the legislation of the Israeli country is based on the Ottoman rule, on the British mandate rules, and on certain legislation that we put throughout the years. The longer it takes, the more Israeli and fundamental legislation that had meant to be happening long time ago. And this is what we're doing today. It's inconvenient for certain people, and some people can interpret it in their own opinions and views, and they can be like, you know, black prophets of as if we're going to destroy it. But the more and more the years go by, we see that Israel becomes a more democratic place, a stronger economy, a safer place. And, you know, it's a symbol of freedom and liberties here in our region.
Okay, so Neri, we have Sharon making an impassioned argument. Are you convinced by any of what she just said?
No, not at all. You know, Ms. Heskel can say that this is a disagreement and that people are allowed to express their views in a democracy. That's absolutely true. The better question is what role, what obligation really politicians, and especially people that are in government, have towards the democracy and the society and the country within which they live and which they lead. What obligation do they have to maintain certain democratic norms, certain norms of civility, the roles and functions of certain institutions? All these are very important questions that the current government, according to not just me and not just Yuval Diskin or other people, but people that serve in government at the moment, oftentimes appointed by Prime Minister Netanyahu, they are the ones issuing warnings as well. So it's not just isolated differences of opinion from people that differ politically with Ms. Heskel and her colleagues. This is widespread people coming out and saying this is a very troubling time and a very troubling trend that we see helmed by the current government. And there's nothing really that I can say to her, because she has obviously differing points of view.
Okay, very briefly, please, Sharon, because I have to wrap. Very briefly, yes.
If this is the situation and it is so severe, I would like just to get one name of one journalist that was either imprisoned or forbidden from speaking his opinion. I would like to get one name of a judge that's been imprisoned or shut down or not allowed to speak his mind. And so this is not. But you're saying
that's a very high bar
that our
that Israel
foundations
has
of democracy are
not.
So let me jump in here.
It's the exact complete
Sharon
opposite.
and
We're
Neri,
having a live debate about things
that's
that
great.
we disagree
And
about.
I've got to jump in here, but I thank you very much for having this conversation with me, MK Sharon Haskell and Neri Zilber. Thanks so much. See you soon.